I think we can begin. My name is Renee Hobbs, and I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's webinar on critical literacy blind spots featuring Spencer Brayton and Natasha Casey. I'm just going to share my screen with you, and then we're going to begin. Natasha and Spencer, I think you have a relatively short presentation to share with us, and then that will be followed by a fascinating dialogue, I hope, right?
Mm-hmm.
Fingers crossed.
All right, now give me a thumbs up, my friends, if you can see this screen with the slides. Can you see the screen with the slides? Okay, it looks like it is.
Yep.
Feel free to use the chat room, the chat button. If you haven't used that yet, that goes down in the bottom of the screen, and it lights up orange when somebody puts in an interesting phrase. So feel free to use that great back channel opportunity. All right, Natasha and Spencer, take it away.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Renee, and the Media Education Lab for hosting.
It's nice to see so many people here.
Yeah, it's great. Especially as all my conferences were cancelled, like everybody else. It's nice to connect with some people we've met there. So just a little overview on that second slide, Renee. What we're hoping to do, a tiny little bit of background. We anticipate talking 15, maybe 20 minutes tops, and then leaving 40 minutes or so for, you know, some good discussion around some of the topics. So we wanted to talk a little bit about our collaboration, a little bit about critical theory and pedagogy, how that factors into our collaboration, a little bit about our critical media and information literacy course that we developed together. And then the meat is really 2 and 3 on this list. So the problems that we encountered go into critical information literacy and media literacy conferences, and then some tentative next steps, ideas to consider. Like we said, we're looking at 15, 20 minutes tops.
So when we talk about our course and how Natasha and I kind of came together in terms of critical media and information literacy, we found a lot of shared language and definitions and interests among the two areas when we first started working together. I was teaching information literacy course and then working with Natasha on her media literacy course. So that's sort of how we found each other when I was also at Blackburn College at the time. And then as we started reading about some of the background in each other's areas is where we found some common theoretical influences like Hooks, and a number of other theorists in critical pedagogy.
Renee, if you could hit that next slide for me, please. Thank you. So just a little snapshot of our class, and you can keep going, Renee. I'm not going to read it, but just to give you an idea of the environment that we've been working in for the last 5 years. So we, like Spencer said, we were both together at Blackburn College at the time, which is this tiny liberal arts college in Illinois. When I say tiny, I'm talking about 500 students.
Rural, very rural.
Yeah, very rural. Most students come from a 6-county area around the college. If you keep going, Renee, there's a few other bullets on that. So you can see the kinds of majors and minors it was required for, where it was housed, and some of our influences. Oh, look at that, tip of the hat, Renee Hobbs.
And two, just to mention, in 2016, Trump won the mock election at our college, just to note that for you.
So I'll give you an idea about the political climate on the college and the kinds of students that we're working with. So basically, when we came together, we decided we want to bring media and information literacy together. We're trying to figure out how to integrate critical pedagogy into our classroom. And basically what happened was it really brought into sharp focus for us, I think, the challenges of translating theory into practice. You know, we'd read all this stuff, we were completely motivated by it, but what does it look like in the classroom? And that's sort of signaled the start of our struggle. And we figured, well, there's loads of other people out there doing it, so we'll just tap into those people.
And then how do we implement that without turning our students off? That was a challenge. Next slide. Natasha? Yeah, okay. So what we also looked at in terms of our connection and our co-teaching was what does co-teaching and collaboration actually mean in the classroom? And I think this is where we actually started to reflect on ourselves in the classroom and what we each brought to the classroom and how the students might see our two respective fields in our teaching.
And I think if you hit that bottom part, hit it one more time, Renee, it really, like it says there, forced us to reevaluate our own authority and power in the classroom. I'd never co-taught beyond, a lecture here or a guest lecture there. I was very used to sort of controlling my own classroom. So then when you have somebody come in, but then you decide to go 50-50, it really does put, as Brookfield argues in his great book, if you haven't read it, talking about what actually happens, how the dynamics change when you're co-teaching with somebody and what you can glean from that experience.
And who is this librarian and what the heck does he know about teaching? Next slide, Renee, please.
Come on, baby.
There we go. So of course the classic, we wanted to bring in some frere, we wanted to decenter our role in the classroom, but a lot of students reacted pretty apprehensively to our approach. Obviously most students, as is true for myself, when I was a student, were very used to a more passive form of education. This might not be true for everybody. It certainly was in my case, very conformist, and dare I say it, I'll use it for the first time tonight, neoliberal approaches to education. The idea of paying, you show up, be taught at, listen, study, regurgitate, do your homework, get a grade. And so the idea that we'd be bringing critical pedagogy into the classroom contrasted deeply with the ways in which students had been taught up until that period of time.
And even, as we worked through the class, speaking to that quickly, we actually tried to be honest with students about where we were coming from at the start, rather than just kind of injecting what we felt we wanted to do. And that even didn't work too well for us first go around.
Huh. No, not the first go round. I think we got better at sort of laying out our framework, but I think that definitely took some time. On that next slide, Renee, I think there's a little excerpt from our chapter. What we began to notice over time were basically evasive strategies and tactics that students would take, rather than necessarily, and I know some people have written about this, about the enormous conflict that came out of classroom discussions post the election of Trump, but really that wasn't our experience at all. Our experience was much more, and I think this has something to do with the fact that most of our students are first generation students, working class, and generally disenfranchised overall. I think they're not keen to go toe to toe with any professor, but they're keen to avoid these kinds of controversies in the classroom.
Yeah, and Hooks's quote on the next slide, Renee, continues to sort of support this challenge when she talks about the bourgeois culture, reinforcing a system of rewards, agreeing with the instructor, no sort of critique and bias.
So then we sort of return then to on the next slide, Renee, is sort of as was pointed out to me earlier today, because I didn't make my slides. This is the advantage of having a partner at home who's got a much better design eye than I do. He goes, "Oh, I guess that's your thesis then, is it?" I was like, "Well, now that you mention it, yes, it is." So, are we even teaching if we're just trying to swap out students' ideologies for our own? So that was sort of our central question that we wanted to investigate when we started off on this work.
So next we want to kind of go over a couple of experiences that we had when we were trying to implement critical pedagogy, going to conferences together in each other's fields. We wanted to be with our people, right? And so this is also a little snip from the book too. So in 2017, we went to a critical information literacy related conference. A question was posed, how to get students excited about social justice issues. Representative from the panel responded that you don't give students essentially a choice in the matter. It's not an option. What other questions are there?
And then, not unlike that, we also had an experience at a critical media literacy conference the next year, where people were talking about it's really important. Trump has been in a year and a bit at this point, and that it was our job to teach students, quote unquote, the right way. And the reactions in the room were typically, yes, you are right. And for us, it was disconcerting because it seemed to just basically go against the grain of everything critical pedagogy sets out to address. So that was pretty interesting. And that's just a couple of examples, right? Couple of personal anecdotes from some of the experiences that we had.
And these sort of scenarios and really sort of launched us into this next phase of what we really wrote about in the chapter and why we did. So on the next slide, sort of quoting Zoe Williams, when she talks about unmediated fury.
Hold on here.
Yeah, so if you just hit the button a couple more times there, Renee, for me. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So in this article, Zoe Williams argues, and plenty of others have argued this as well, that a side effect of what she called unmediated fury is that it gates off all other less exhilarating responses, such as empathy. And again, if you can sort of cast your mind back to, November 2016, we were seeing this amongst our quote unquote own people. And it was, of course, it's something that we typically accuse, who the other side of whatever. I mean, I hate this binary anyway, us versus them. I think it's ludicrous, but this is the world that we live in. And so we were frustrated by that. There's one more bullet on there. So yeah, one of the questions that we can pose at the end or think about is, are our critical information literacy or critical media literacy communities overly consumed with this idea of unmediated fury, and what are the consequences of being so preoccupied?
Again, related to that then is Kaplan, Gimbel, and Harris's idea about the boomerang effect, that people shut down when their beliefs are challenged, right? No matter if they're sort of factual. And even in the LIS field, Nicole Cook has written about this, about the post-truth era, that consumers will deliberately pass over objective facts in favor of information that agrees with or confirms their existing belief, she writes.
Yeah, this emotional dimension to information behavior, I think, is pretty interesting. So it's like, if we took that fury, we put it into the classroom, is it going to have what effect is it going to have in the classroom? Is it going to have a blowback or boomerang effect as well? So then we came up tentatively with a few ideas in the chapter about how we need to be sort of conscious of our own beliefs, how those ideas come out, and obviously the potential impact that has on students. One of the pieces that we looked at was by Musa Al-Garbi, which I think is a really interesting idea. And he argues here that I'm going to do what you never do in a class, right? Which is read the slide, but I think it's worth taking a minute. He says, highly educated or intelligent people tend to be far more ideological than the general public. And while educated people might be less likely to discriminate against others on the basis of factors like race, they are significantly more likely to be prejudiced against people who think differently than them or hold different ideological commitments. I think that's a pretty powerful idea, something that at least we need to think about and consider.
Yeah, and we quoted, not in the chapter, but since then, Larry Grossberg a few times, in terms of, I think, getting more at understanding others and critical dialogue. He writes here, I'm suggesting that we need to find ways to address people where they are if we are to move them and society to more humane possibilities. And then the next slide, we go on with him again, a little longer quote.
I think the only part that I would highlight here, and of course it's like, again, it's what you should never do in a classroom, right, is put a huge block of text like that up on the board. But I think the first line is worth thinking about seriously. A democratic politics requires one to approach the task of moving people, of winning them to your position, of approaching them with some humility. And I think that's the thing that we value in our classroom, and it was the thing that was missing for us, and still continues to be missing a little bit, I think, when you're trying to move people one way or another. And that article by Grossberg, I think, is definitely worth a read. It came out 2018, towards the end of 2018, in Cultural Studies, the journal.
So these next steps are sort of are wrapping up our chapter and what we discussed. So faculty could benefit from their own awareness and lack of viewpoint diversity. This idea of radical empathy. And as well, we didn't note it in the slide, but I referred to it earlier, critical dialogue by Libby Morris. She writes that critical dialogue is more than basic communication skills. It is an active group process, an opportunity for students and faculty members to learn how to engage in civil, respectful, and difficult conversations.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to point out that we're not advocating, of course, just in case anybody would think that, but we're not advocating, for hate speech in the classroom or anything like that. We obviously have rules about what, should and shouldn't, is acceptable or appropriate in a classroom environment. But I don't think we should also shut down people whose perspectives are different from others. So that's where the critical dialogue, I think, is so important. There's not an institution in the country that doesn't say that they want students to critically think, but that's grand. But what about the critical dialogue part? Because if you don't actually, overtly exchange those ideas, what good is the critical thinking part?
This slide is kind of, I think, where this sort of area and this conversation is crossing different disciplines. This is a psychologist who stumbled upon our work and tweeted this out. So I think it maybe shows sort of how these conversations are growing.
Yeah, I'd never heard that sort of language that he uses, but he's coming from, like, as Spencer said, a social psychology point of view. And it's interesting, maybe this is a rift that other people are seeing at their institution between left-wing authoritarians and left-wing egalitarians, as he characterized it, which I think is an interesting idea. And you can see that tweet is only from a couple of weeks ago. So it's a relatively new idea for us anyway. I wanted to plug, there's a website for our chapters in this book. And the editors of the book have a website, and you can go and look there's a bunch of other really fantastic chapters. It's 95% librarians.
Yes.
So check it out if you have a chance. That's our contact info. And then the last thing we thought we would do is maybe pose some, well, a little humor, just a little bit. But if you hit the next button, Renee, you won't have to look at that all night. If you hit, yeah, there you go. So we put some questions up, but you might have others that have been generated. I see there's lots written in the chat box, which I haven't looked at yet, but maybe we'll end there and open it up and see what happens.
Wow. Okay, you have given us a lot to think about. Now, if you joined us after we started the chat, which we're happy that you did, we just want to remind you that there's a great conversation happening in the chat. Please feel free. But now, basically, we're going to open it up for comments and questions. I bet you have some thoughts you'd like to share. Who wants to go first? Just take it away.
Well, I'll start. I've observed in working with students that they are lacking many skills that are really important to have a critical conversation. For one thing, they aren't used to a classroom where they have power and where they're encouraged to speak and where they're encouraged to think differently and explore. And so in a way, I think we're up against a lot of training on how to be a student, in the first place. And so we have, the power dynamics going on. We have the lack of experience in terms of kind of taking charge and expressing their thoughts. I've also observed that students are much more adept at expressing feelings than they are at expressing thoughts and thinking. And they often don't see the difference between feeling and thinking. And so I've found that I have to spend some time on working with them on that so that they can identify the difference between feeling words and thinking words. So I think we have a lot of barriers in the first place to even begin to have a conversation. And then, of course, having the conversation requires a whole nother level of skills and experience in terms of something like media literacy that many students don't really have a lot of exposure to. So it seems to me that, we have the traditional classroom that works against us in introducing new ways of exploring and questioning in the classroom.
Thanks for sharing that great comment. Tessa, I also feel like my students don't easily distinguish between feeling and thinking, and the consequences of that are challenging. But your observation that they're not used to having power is partly because of what's happened in the K-12 context, right? Which is they've been trained to do the things that Natasha and Spencer talked about, to be obedient and to withhold their own thoughts and feelings. And in some ways, that requires a whole lot of unlearning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know how other people handle this, if they take a critical approach in their class, how they deal with it in the classroom. If they think students are agreeing with them just to agree with them, or I'd love to hear how other people handle this.
Well, I'll just comment on the feeling and thinking idea in that, I was really frustrated with my students. These were undergraduates in California at a very racially diverse university. And so we were doing some deconstruction exercises, and I was trying to work with them on developing the skills they needed. And finally, one day in pure frustration, I said, I don't care about your feelings. I want to hear what you think. Because it was all about the feelings, and they were very adept at expressing feelings. And so I think they were so surprised that, I really confronted them that way, that we had a really productive conversation then about, well, how do you express your thoughts? And, and then we went into some examples, and that was very helpful because they needed some modeling on what the difference was, and they needed some modeling and practice in developing their own expressive abilities.
Thanks for making that point. Anybody else want to chime in here?
It's been a while since I taught at the university level, but when I did, the way I got past the thinking and feeling thing was to use media literacy analysis. And what I did was, commercials are designed to elicit emotion rather than logic, at the expense of logic, usually, because there isn't a logical reason to buy most products, so they have to sell you some other way. so teaching that concept and, you know, pointing out slogans, the one I remember from when I was teaching was, you know, Gallo, because the wine remembers. What? You know, we did a bunch like that. And so it was fun, right? Initially, but it got the point across that, yeah, we've been subjected to this culture where we're asked to suspend logic and feel all the time, and that's consumer culture. And then they were all too ready to kind of jump on and say, oh, well, but then I'm kind of, you know, being manipulated or whatever. I mean, that's a simplistic way of describing the dynamics, but just for the sake of time, I'll kind of truncate it to that, right? And then they were able to come on board and say, okay, so let's look at this from the alternative, but without devaluing the emotional side. And for me, that was the key to kind of open it up. That now I taught women's studies. There were a lot of things we dealt with that had very visceral emotional responses from students, and that was completely appropriate. But they also understood that you had to get to the logical side.
Thank you very much for sharing that.
I also had a question though, and it was this us then that we come into, you know, with, especially in these political times and stuff. It's like, so I'm curious to know about strategies to help establish actual common ground, or to help students see existing common ground.
Yeah, I know. I think I'll just jump in, because I think people who practice critical theory and pedagogy are sort of split on this, whether you should be completely open with your students about your sort of political viewpoint and let the chips fall where they may. I have the benefit, I think, of a little bit of a disguise as a foreigner, quote unquote. So I play that up a little bit, and it does prevent me. I do not, my students would freak out if they actually knew what my political thoughts and feelings were. So that is not an area that I think is lucrative for common ground. That's why I think
that's disingenuous, though, to not tell them what you're.
Mark, make the point. Make the point.
Well, so I'm a storyteller. I haven't taught in higher education in more than a decade. Most of my stuff is at a younger level and a multi-generational level. And one thing that I have learned is I can't do anything political, because you never know where people are. But I've been trying to find a way to reframe this idea that we're divided. And I'll tell you that story in a minute, but it seems to me that if you have an opinion that your students are somewhere other than where they ought to be, that if you're hiding where you are, that you're sort of not engaging with them on their own ground.
Yeah, I think the difference for me would be in the way that you worded it. I don't think that they ought to be someplace else. Like, I don't think that is the purpose. And I don't think that is the purpose of critical pedagogy. I think when you look at the foundational texts like Hooks and like Freire, you know, would you like people to be, quote unquote, on your side or in your camp? For sure. But I'm not going to beat them over the head to get them there. So I don't come from that perspective that I feel like they ought to be someplace.
Tessa, you and I have talked about this a little bit too, haven't we? Around the idea about whether or not there is that media literacy with its open-ended approach to critical inquiry doesn't have an end point. And that's partly why it's hard to measure it, right? Because like, what is the outcome, right? And we have talked together about our concern that when media literacy is framed as a way to build awareness about race, class, or gender, then that there's like a predetermined outcome, and that the inquiry is kind of compromised sometimes by that predetermined outcome.
Well, and it also can be a real turnoff for students, and in that if they perceive that there is a predetermined outcome that they should prescribe to, well, then what's the point of the inquiry in the first place? Then, you know, you might as well just spoon shovel it and say, you know, here's what I think you ought to believe. Whereas the skills that we're really trying to build, I believe, in media literacy are exploratory and questioning and challenging, and so I don't think there should be a predetermined outcome, because we're looking at the questions, and we're not saying we have all the answers. We're saying we have the questions, and we have a way of questioning, especially media, that is pretty reliable in terms of giving us some methods for that exploration. So it's not saying what the exploration should say or should do in the end. It's more about the process of the exploration itself. And that's quote unquote the end goal, even though it's a continuum that can always be improved upon.
Spencer and Natasha, have you guys ever managed to have your students explain in terms of your classroom where they're coming from in a way that you understand it?
Spencer, I don't know if you want to jump in or.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that was part of the transition for us, from pulling back from we have all the answers to this is not working in the classroom. This is not an approach that we're comfortable with. And so when you pull back, of course, you have to pull the students out and they have to participate more. And so I think over time we did get a little bit more insight, but I think that level of reluctance was still quite high, much more so for the conservative students, or, you know, students who would label themselves that way, than it was for the so-called, you know, liberal students, whatever those might be. So I think it's very tricky to do, which is why I totally get your point, and I think it's a fair one about being upfront about your political beliefs, but I just haven't found that to be a very successful strategy when I have gone sort of, you know, all guns blazing. That hasn't worked in the classroom, and it's like it has forced me to think about it, you know, which is kind of counter to my personality, really, to be honest with you.
And I think too, you know, some of that has to do with the makeup of the class. You know, we're in this sort of rural setting with this sort of radius of you know, majority white students, but also, you know, at the time we also had admissions counselor in the Chicago area trying to get African American students to enroll in the college. And so you have this sort of diverse setting. And so with these students in this class for this semester trying to trust each other, and sort of maintain a balance of where they are, and is this person going to, you know, respect me for who I am and where I'm coming from, and vice versa, I think would have been a lot for them too.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fear, I think, is one of the things I really noticed. You know, you always have the students who are very vocal about where they stand, but I think the majority are very, very fearful. They're worried about their grade. They're worried about your power in the classroom. They're worried about how other people will see them. And so you can't really have an honest conversation. You can't really get to that critical dialogue, because fear really, you know, is the order of the day.
Donalyn.
I've joined the conversation late, so I hope what I'm about to say isn't too repetitive. But as I'm listening to the conversation, we're mostly talking about the classroom setting where we're face-to-face talking among our students. I've had very good success with setting the tone for the term by emphasizing with students that it's not my opinion that matters. It's your opinion as you develop these tools to help critically engage with media. And I pair the in-class oral conversations with using discussion board through Canvas. And I've had very good success with that, because students feel more comfortable, especially what I would consider to be international students as a professor here in the US. They are much more comfortable typing out their opinions and supporting their opinions than they do that in class. And as the term moves forward, you know, like a lot of people, I suspect, I feel myself having a conversation of one. But as the term moves forward, they then do become more familiar talking aloud in class. Mm-hmm. So I think pairing the oral with the written communication can be a really effective strategy.
Thanks for sharing that. Good idea. Other perspectives on this issue?
Yeah, I think what I noticed in my class of philosophy of education, that some students are more trained in critical discussion than others. And in my class, it was more obviously because there are the Jewish students and the Arab students. The Arab students are, most all of them are females, and there was a really, I will call it a gap between the Jewish students and the Arab students, which actually reproduced the inequality of society. And what happened in the end is that more involved students took over the discussion, and the others kept out, really.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a powerful story. And raise your hand if you've experienced that in the classroom, right? So some of us have experienced that in the classroom. Can I ask you guys a question? Reading your chapter, I feel the most startling place of reflection for me was your observation about how these power games are reproduced in our own professional discourses. That's the part of your chapter that gave me chills. So my question is, how the hell did you have the guts to write about it? And why do those practices occur, do you think?
I mean, I think we had a lot of support to write about it. I don't want to speak for you, Natasha, but I think, we sort of pitch a chapter and, we figure what the heck, if it's accepted or not, we at least feel, we see value in our work, and, we'll try it out. So I think we had some very supportive editors to help us through that process. And sorry, go ahead, Natasha.
No, you're grand. Keep going.
What was your second question, Renee? No, I forgot.
So the first one was, how did you have the guts to do it? And you say you had editorial support. And why do you think those kind of power dynamics are enacted in our professional communities?
I think we like to go to these conferences with like-minded people. We like to sort of be in those echo chambers at times, and ourselves as educators, and feel that we're among people that think like us, without reflecting on maybe our own selves.
Yeah, I think it was too easy post Trump election. Just seemed to be too easy to just complain about these people, or who did this and how is this possible, and that sort of, that's why I think that idea of fury, that unmediated fury, I think is a really interesting idea, and that the whole emotional component is something that I don't have a background in. My background is purely like cultural studies, media studies, sort of classic stuff. But I think it's really fascinating. And then to answer your first part of your question, Renee, we have no friends anyway, so we're not going to lose anybody by writing this. So we're fine on that. But I would definitely echo, Bob was great. Bob really encouraged us, one of the editors, to do a little auto ethnography, which is very outside our comfort zone, and very antithetical to how we've been trained to write. and what we think of as acceptable as academic writing. So like Spencer said, we had great support, but I think the other part is we can be smug. We have to check ourselves. We want to check everybody else. Like we also have to hold that lens up to ourselves. And I include myself in that as well.
I was going to mention that I think that idea about fury, it's really interesting. I think there have been some people who have been writing about sort of the historical accomplishments of anger, right? Where in women's movements and in movements for civil rights and things like that, it was actually anger that was able to, kind of move the issue forward. So I think it's interesting because again, trying to complicate the relationship between how feelings work and then how the intellect works, then I guess the question is, how do you talk about anger in a way that that addresses its ability to actually accomplish, moving things toward a better position of social justice without necessarily being, I don't know what the term is because the term civility is so loaded, but without imposing necessarily a particular like behavioral condition on the expression. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know what to do with it, but I understand what you're saying.
Well, I think because one other part of this is I think that students now, and you can all tell me I'm nuts if you haven't seen this, but I think students are getting into our classrooms, if they have a conservative background, thinking they've already been marginalized.
Right.
Yeah.
That the educational is, and unfortunately, I think it's the same thing as like, the New York Times is a leftist rag being an opinion constructed by the right. I think their ideas about their political position are a result of the right basically turning everything that's involved in higher education into leftist propaganda. I've seen things on Twitter where, because we're all going to be doing these recordings of our lectures and things like that, and there's a right-wing student organization that's trying to collect those to collect the indoctrination that we're all doing. So there's a very aggressive campaign to try to make sure that, that when students come in, they already feel like they're, already being shoved to the side and taken for granted, and they have to be careful so we don't, cram their heads full of our indoctrination.
Mm-hmm.
Ralph, I think that's so interesting because one of the things that's happened in the last several years that I didn't see early on, that I didn't see 20 years ago when I was teaching, or 30 years ago when I was teaching, is that there is an assumption somehow that professors should be objective like journalists.
Mm-hmm.
That was never the case. In fact, it was the opposite. You were never objective. It was all about, presenting your own point of view, your take, your expertise. That was the whole point of like earning a PhD. You were now the expert in this particular thing. And, so that's just an interesting observation. But I also think the challenge for me is we want to open up space for students to genuinely explore. At the same time, we are imposing certain kinds of values. And the value may not be over a specific narrow political issue, but the whole premise of media literacy inquiry is that we value reason-based, evidence-based discourse.
It's critical.
We're imposing that value, right? And saying, no, you don't get to diverge from that. We actually think evidence is important. And I'll share very briefly. One of the courses that I used to teach was history of the Holocaust. And I had a student once who I failed because she wrote an entire final exam about how Hitler was the incarnation of Satan. And she meant it. I mean, she meant it theologically, right? This was a history class. This was, there was nothing that I would consider valid historical evidence. It didn't matter to her. Her worldview was, I see the world in theological terms.
Wow.
And that's how I'm interpreting. And at some point you have to say, okay, that's good, interesting work to do in the world. It's not the work we're doing in this course.
So Faith, are you saying that in a way, media literacy is a form of indoctrination that is trying to indoctrinate people to accept reasoning, evidence, and argument as superior forms of epistemology, superior ways of knowing?
No, actually, I'm not. I'm saying that there are skills. So I like to use sports metaphors a lot, so you'll have to forgive me for those of you who are not sports fans. But if you're a baseball pitcher, there are ways that you learn to hold the ball so that it will do different things when you throw it, right? It's a skill set. It's not imposing a style on a given pitcher. If you ever watch pitchers, they have lots of different styles, but if you want to throw a curveball or you want to throw a ball that's going to sink, you have to start by holding it a certain way. That's kind of the parallel I see with media literacy, that there have to be, that's why I asked about common ground. Like, what are the common ground basic things that we just accept of, we have to be able to use these tools. Whether you use them outside the course or not, that's up to you. But there have to be these common ground tools, and our tools are based on largely reason and evidence, although I would add, I think reflection and being aware of your emotional responses, being aware of other things that influence our interactions, our relationship with media, and how it helps us build a relationship to the world, or how it mediates our relationship to the world, matters. But I think if it turns out to be indoctrination, we're doing it wrong.
Can I share a story?
Please.
So as a storyteller, I've been trying to find a way to deal with what's going on in the world, not this particular 2-week period of what's going on in the world, but previous to this. And I came across a story that's built into our culture. Everybody knows that there are there's really only one slogan on every piece of currency, every coin, which is e pluribus unum. And that was originally the 13 colonies coming together. What I'd like to say is that for today, that actually talks about the diversity of our conversation, and that people say that our nation is divided, but it's not true. We have all of these diverse conversations, and that diversity is making us stronger. Perhaps coming from the idea that there is this emotional component, there is this critical, rhetorical component. These are not dialectic, that if we acknowledge both of them and bring those together, then that's maybe a way to frame it in a way that people can understand it, both in the intellectual versus emotional, but also the left versus right or conservative liberal conversation.
Thanks for sharing that. Now, tonight in our last 9 minutes, there's a reason why you chose to participate in this webinar. There was a reason why this idea of blind spots, critical pedagogy blind spots, why it captured your interest. So let's just go around the room and talk a little bit about, how is this topic relevant to us? Why are you participating in this conversation tonight?
This is the part where you find out how many people we paid to attend.
I'll take a turn if that's okay.
Thanks.
It's Michael. So New York City recently transitioned to distance online learning per the recent crisis. And I'm very interested in how teachers are thinking about how they're designing online projects for their students and how they're thinking about their instruction. And I'm seeing a very big trend towards teacher-centered instruction because they are very unfamiliar with the tools. So they fall back on their content knowledge. Yeah. And it becomes very sage on the stage while they're trying to engage students with their first shot at online distance learning. So I wanted to kind of acquire the vocabulary to speak to them about how they're approaching their practice in distance learning and focusing on the relationships with students and engaging students in critical conversations, not just putting content in front of them.
Wow, that is
Yeah.
huge. Thanks for sharing. Who else?
Michael, if you're on Twitter, follow the hashtag DigPed, DIGPED, and you'll see loads of discussions around this topic right now.
Okay, we'll definitely follow that hashtag. Thanks.
How does this work relate to your practice? Why are you here? Samantha.
So this is interesting to me because I have tried really hard to apply critical pedagogy to a field that doesn't typically acknowledge it as relevant to its practice, which is journalism. And so in teaching critical thinking about journalism in the classroom, I've come up against some of these pitfalls where I try to express like, okay, there's no right or wrong way to think about this, but here's how we, should be thinking about our differences in how we see the world, or, how reality is constructed, or how that, how those processes are related to the construction of journalism, et cetera. And what I find is that more often than I'd like, at the end of the course, people will say, or, the students will be doing a presentation, for example, where they say, okay, so we're going to talk to you about sources, and keep in mind, there's no right or wrong. You can't think about this in a right or wrong way. And then they just kind of go off the rails, like with this totally weird idea of the literal meaning of right and wrong here. And I don't know, I've just come up against some of these things that you're describing, or some of the pitfalls that an unexperienced, critical teacher would probably experience. So that's why I'm here, to try and share my pitfalls and learn, I guess.
Thanks for sharing. Why are you here? How is this relevant to your life, to your work, to your practice?
I'll speak to that. I've run across some articles and references in conservative media, and I've seen it quoted on things like Apple News or Google alerts. And there's criticism of media literacy as being kind of a liberal tool, and of course that isn't the way I see media literacy at all. And so I have, though, experienced at conferences and so on, people who are really righteous, about their political stances and beliefs. And to me, they've kind of confused some of those beliefs and attitudes with media literacy and with media literacy practices. And I think that can be very destructive in terms of the field, because I think if we get a reputation as being, politically biased, that it cuts off conversation and it misrepresents this whole notion of media literacy being about exploration and really teaching the skills to be able to question and explore. So I'm very disturbed by, this kind of us versus them that Spencer and Natasha talked about, and I've experienced it myself. And so I really want to explore that, and I also would like to really get into that self-reflective mode that you talked about, Natasha. I really respect that, and I think we need more of it.
Thanks for sharing. Why are you here? How is this relevant to your practice? We have time for about 2 more people.
I'll share. This is my first time using this microphone. Is this working?
Yeah, you sound great.
So I work in a high school in the Boston suburbs, and I used to work in a school that was very culturally diverse, and there was like progressively minded, critically minded. The school I currently work in is not like that, and is predominantly white, but also students of color come in from Boston, and in survey data, it's like 2 different experiences in this high school. There's the predominantly white population that says, we don't have problems here, like you're reading too much into this. And then students of color who are saying, we are not we don't feel welcome here. This is not a welcoming place. And I just really worry, like I really want to help my colleagues to adopt pedagogical practices that will examine some of these tensions in the classroom, but my colleagues don't see it. They don't understand. And I don't know how well I do like juggling that, but it seems like a really significant issue, and I need to like develop my own pedagogy around that.
Thank you for sharing. Very, very powerful. Who's going to have the last word? Why are you here? How is this relevant in practice? Raviv.
I feel two contradict approaches. One is the maybe the silencing approach, the tending to neutrality and not being involved in on these political issues, which I feel especially within the K-12 system. And in contradiction, there is an approach that I feel is sometimes confusing
Brush teeth.
with cynicism. In a way, I find myself sometimes cynical rather than critical, and I find it hard to find this golden path of really critical discussion and really critical discourse, and I think that's what brought me here.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to share the screen with you one last time. I think it's a really interesting set of questions that Spencer and Natasha have posed for us about what strategies beyond authoritarian strategies can be effective, and how do we manage student resistance to critical thinking about media. And is there a place for radical empathy or critical dialogue? And is there a danger that what we're doing might simply entrench ideologically opposite beliefs? Those are powerful questions for us to reflect on tonight. And so I do want to give Natasha and Spencer a round of applause. So put your virtual hands together. Yes, you are virtually joining us. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's webinar. We invite you to participate in our virtually viral hangouts every day this week from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern. And of course, Sam, can you say a few words about our upcoming DigiURI book club featuring the amazing Ralph Bellevue?
Yeah, so I think it's April 6th. We're going to be featuring a podcast that Ralph actually does. I don't know how often you do it, once a month?
Well, it's gotten kind of irregular, unfortunately, these days, but we've done 62 episodes, so it's been around for a couple of years. In fact, somebody just mentioned something about Mike Caulfield. We've actually had him on the podcast twice, and we've had Natasha on the podcast before too.
So the name of the podcast that we're going to be listening to, one episode, is Media and the End of the World. So that being said, let's wave goodbye. Good night, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Bye-bye.